There's an illness in our country affecting nearly 1 in 5 Americans. What if I told you that this illness was responsible for things like heart disease, unemployment, and disability? What if I told you that this illness wreaks havoc on our global economy, costing countries a combined $1 trillion each year? And what if this very same illness often goes unattended, undetected, and mostly ignored by our culture and faith communities? What is it? Mental illness. The silence is deafening, the shame, the guilt, the isolation, keeping people from seeking the help they need.
But what if I told you there's hope for healing, a place for honest conversations, and the possibility of help? What if the church opened its doors as a safe space, helping us realize we're not alone?
Well, good morning, Beach Church. How are you guys today? Good. If we haven't met, I'm Pastor Emmanuel. I'm one of the pastors here at Beach Church. Today, we're going to continue our series on mental health, but we have a very special treat with us today. We have a special guest that is going to be sharing with you guys on the topic of grief, and this man, Pastor Michael, is the guy that started his life with Jesus, wanting to be a missionary and serving in all different places around the world. Eventually, he felt called to come to Beach Church and get equipped as an intern. So he did our internship that we offer here at Beach Church. He then came on staff as a pastor here at Beach. And eventually, him and his family felt the calling to go and serve the community again. And so they moved to Detroit, Michigan, to be a part of a movement that is lighting that city on fire. He is now one of the people that is involved in Detroit Church as an elder. He's going to continue to work with them and doing ministry for the gospel. And he's the epitome of our mission of reach, raise up, and release followers of Jesus who change the world. And I'm excited now because one of the things that we get to do with our internship is that now we're taking our interns and sending them to Detroit for a week, so they can learn from Pastor Michael and his family in the ministry there what it looks like to live a life devoted to serving the kingdom of heaven. So we're seeing this cycle continue. He's an incredible man, a personal friend of mine, and I am so blessed to have him here. Pastor Michael, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
All right, good morning, guys. It's so good to be here. It's always one of my favorite weeks of the year to get to come down and escape the other side of I-75 in the country and do what most people in Michigan do and spend a week in Florida at least once a year. It was 35 degrees in Detroit this morning, so that's what I'm getting to miss right now. My wife and kids are still up there. My boys are in soccer, and so they had games all weekend, so they're driving down starting today, and we'll get here tomorrow. So I get to fly in, stay in for the next 2 nights, staying with Emmanuel, which I slept okay because it's too quiet. When you live in the city, you need a siren or two to like lull you to sleep, right? When you're not around that anymore, you notice it, right? So then I was like, it's too quiet out here, which is usually a bad sign. So as Emmanuel said, my name is Michael. I am an extension of this Beach Church family, right? This is a place to call home. I had the pleasure and the benefit of really being raised up here in the few years I got to spend here and released back into the mission field. And for us, that was inner city Detroit. And while we're there, we have 2 primary focuses in Detroit. One of which is we work with predominantly Black churches in the Black community in discipleship and empowerment. And that's where I get to serve alongside, a shout out to my Detroit church family who's up there, who are amazing people who live in the city. And then as well as, if you didn't know this, Detroit, the metro area of Detroit, is home to the largest population of Muslims in the world outside of an actual Muslim nation. Right, so we have over 400,000 Arab Muslims that live in the Detroit metro area. So like our main ministry facility is in one of those predominant communities. So if you stay with us, as the interns got to see not too long ago, like you can hear the Islamic call to prayer 5 times a day over a speaker in the city. Every elected official in that town is Muslim. And so that's our predominant spot that we do ministry. on a day-to-day basis. From many people who are from countries that you cannot actually send someone to right now, because according to missions, we call that a closed country. Meaning if you can't get visas to get in, even if you did get in, the risk is very, very high. But we have those people living in our neighborhood. And so our goal is, instead of thinking, how do we just get somebody into a foreign nation, actually, how do we reach someone in our neighborhood who then can turn around, who knows the culture, knows the language, and already has family, friends, connections, that they then turn around and be the gospel movement back into their communities, and which then filter back into their home country, right? So that's what we breathe in and day out. And really, you guys are a part of that, whether you know it or not, because it's the generosity of this church that really fuels how we're able to be there. So you are a part of what that looks like from afar. Okay, so we have, I have too many notes to actually do justice to this topic. And I'll say that up front. My disclaimer is I'm far from a medical professional, a mental health professional. I, on most days, need a mental health professional, which is, again, it should be normal, right? So I'm putting that as a disclaimer as I try to tackle this topic. Right, this topic that we're talking about this morning is grief and loss, which is unique probably in this series, right? You've already covered a lot of different things, from anxiety to family of origin, lots of things that are not only root causes, but also diagnosable things. And grief, it's not like you can go to a doctor and get diagnosed with grief. That's not quite the same. But what you do realize, number one, is grief touches every one of us. Right, there's no way to walk through the life that we have without either experiencing grief to different levels or the grief happening all around us, right? It's part of a broken world that we live in. So you will come into contact, or probably have to different extents already, with the depths of grief and loss, especially when we've lost people in our lives, right? So we cannot avoid that. But what we're talking about is what happens when we don't deal with that grief in a healthy manner, right? And this is where it leads into further mental health issues, all right? So undealt with grief through lots of different avenues can lead to things like anxiety. It can lead to bitterness. It can lead to anger. So somebody can be walking around angry and bitter, and really, it's not because of just their personality. It's not because of who they are. It's because they've went through something in their life, or they've lost someone, that something's happened, and the way that was dealt with has now turned into these further things. So grief is what we call a foundational issue. And if it's not walked through properly, then it can lead to further and further difficulties. Okay, so that's where we're really going. The Bible has a lot to say on grief, right? Because it's a part of the normal everyday experience. But let's start maybe a little bit on the psychology end of things and get some definitions, right? So these definitions I got are from the American Psychological Association, so that way I can, it's not mine. So just in defining what do we mean by grief, right? So then this first definition, it defines grief as the anguish experienced after significant loss, usually the death of a beloved person. Grief is often distinguished from bereavement and mourning. This is something I found interesting, right? Sometimes when we talk about grief, we just mean like grief, and that's the word that covers all things. But it's really a little more nuanced than that. Because you can break down grief and grieving as two slightly different things, okay? So if we look at just the word grief, we more define this as it's the emotional toll of experiencing loss. Okay, now this is all from, again, medical health professionals that I'm borrowing from. They found that it's helpful to separate the emotion that we experience when we experience grief than the process of grieving. And we'll get into why that's important, right? Because here's the thing, when you've gone through something intense, especially losing someone in your life, you really don't have a choice after that point as to when that emotion is going to pop up, right? You're gonna go through intense loss right off the bat. But 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, that emotion will pop up again. All it takes is one little thing in our life to remind us of that circumstance, right? So that's the one thing. The emotion is going to be there. However, when they talk about the grieving process, that's the second definition. The grieving or mourning, they more define as the process as to how do we to respond to the emotion of grief. All right, so here's the thing. When in the past, when these have been lumped together, it creates this idea that, oh, if I'm getting healthy, then that means I should no longer feel the emotion anymore. But when that doesn't go away, then people get spiraled into further and further depression, right? Because they're like, I should be over this. It's been 2 years. Why am I still feeling this way? And psychologists have determined that's not a helpful way to approach this. The emotion is going to pop up. What we need to focus on is how do we do a proper and healthy process to where we're able to respond to the emotion differently as time passes, right? So I can tell you from my experience, I guarantee you nothing that anyone in here has not probably experienced before, but obviously not only losing people in my life, like my wife and I have gone through different levels of experience and loss in pregnancy. Like we've even lived overseas in a closed nation working for the gospel and lost a child in that time. Right? I can tell you that there are still times that emotion comes up. It's not like I get a choice in that matter. However, how I respond to that, whether it derails my entire day or not, is a part of the process of grieving. Right? That emotion's different when it first happened to on the 1-year anniversary of being reminded that we went through that, to now that it's been several years, I can still feel the pain and the loss, but it no longer will derail my entire life every time it comes up. Now I can just go, I can acknowledge the emotions that come up, but also say, I can also experience celebration, joy, all these things. Because here's the danger, right? The danger here is when we don't do this properly, we don't engage in our grief, our emotions are complicated. So you can't, according to psychologists, you cannot suppress one emotion without suppressing the others. I know that's fun. That's good news for you this morning, right? You cannot suppress grief and then expect for things like joy and love to not also be suppressed. So this is the magnitude of what we're talking about. So when we go through experience loss in our life, if we don't allow ourselves to feel the emotions and to grieve, but again, we kind of find a way to jump to a resolution or a justification, then we also start to limit the other parts of our life that can experience the goodness in our life. And then we become slightly lesser version of ourselves. And the people around us that are still around will get a lesser version of ourselves. Right? So this is why we want to take some time on this. These are, there's also this traditional thing called the 5 stages of grief. Probably heard these before. I put stages in parentheses because it's slightly nuanced. But the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Anybody heard these before at some point in time? These are usually more well-known, right? And I put stages in parentheses or in quotation marks because you have to understand these are not like, oh, now that I've experienced loss, let's go to step 1. Then we go to step 2. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes we may experience that in this order, but sometimes our first reaction, we may jump straight to anger, right? Over something, an injustice that's happened and has created a loss, right? So these are not step-by-step instructions. These are, though, things we can go through in the process of grieving. So not to think of, oh, if I'm in this stage, then I've done it wrong. Not necessarily. Our emotions dictate a lot of times where it goes, depending on what we've experienced. But let's be honest, just because we know that grief sometimes is most intensely felt when we've lost a person, that's not the only time grief shows up, right? We experience grief through lots of different avenues. Sometimes it's we've lost a job or a career, and we grieve the loss that creates, right? The uncertainty of all of a sudden being unemployed right? That is a step of grief. There's sometimes when we have friendships that just end for a variety of reasons, whether that's healthy, unhealthy, but we can grieve the loss of a friend that we just no longer have good relationship with. Sometimes actually when you move to a new place, I've done this several times, there's always this moment of like when you've moved to somewhere new, there's a moment of grief where you grieve the things that you've left behind, right? And that's even in a healthy way, right? It doesn't mean you left in bad terms, but sometimes when God just calls you on to something new, you got a new job in a new state, it could be lots of things, but you can grieve the community that you no longer have, right? The people, the environment that you don't get to experience anymore. All of these are ways grief can show up, right? And those are a spectrum of emotions that can come with those, right? From some to more intense to some not so much. Grief, as we said, it's all through the Bible, right? It's the human emotion. And the Bible's amazing at displaying the full range of the human experience. Like, can you imagine we have an entire, actually the largest book of the Bible, which is Psalms. And Psalms is not really, first and foremost, a theological expose to God. It's actually a bunch of humans writing about their emotions and what they're experiencing and calling on God in the process. It's like it's one of the main books that it's actually humans directed toward God. And not everything in there is something God needs to act on, right? There's some intense things that you can find in the Psalms. We have a whole five chapter book called Lamentations. That's to lament, to express sorrow for. There's, in the Old Testament, there's a Hebrew word is called atzav. Atzav is one of the words for grief, for grieving. And it's actually expressed in the story of the flood, right? So actually, when God looks on the world and sees the destruction, the sin, the death, the chaos that people that he created are committing, actually never once in the story of the flood is God's anger ever mentioned. The one emotion that's mentioned is grief. And later in different rabbinical writings, as this word progresses, one of the things that they describe, they're very good at bringing descriptions to words. We're not as good at this in our modern language. In English, we like just the definition. We're good. They would give like physical descriptors to kind of help you grasp like, what does this word mean? Atzav was a word that was when you're grieved to a point that you're kind of bent over, you're crying, but there's no sound that's coming out. Like you can't even get a breath in. That's actually the atzav word that's used of God himself over the flood story. Later and anybody know, this is a fun pop quiz for those of you who grew up around church. What is the shortest verse of the Bible? Jesus wept, right? Jesus, as human on earth, God's representative, like God himself in the flesh, and he's on his way to actually call back to life a friend of his who is passed. His friend got sick, Lazarus, and he's on his way to go tell him to come back to life, all right? So you can imagine this. It's not that Jesus doesn't know what the end of the story is, but he's first flooded with Lazarus' sisters, Lazarus' community, who is in the midst of grief. And because of that, his heart is moved, and it says Jesus wept. Jesus didn't come in actually in that story and go, hey, put the tears away, no reason. I'm going to go get him up. He actually just weeps with the family first, right? So bring this up because we as a culture tend to have an aversion to, especially I'd say outward expressions of grief, right? If you've gone to any funeral, I grew up going to funerals, and I grew up in a small town in Tennessee. So funerals were always paired with like lots and lots of food every single time. So when I was a kid, I went to so many funerals that I associated that as like, that's where I had barbecue sandwiches. Because everybody always brought barbecue, like pulled pork barbecue for you to eat. So whenever I asked my parents, like, when are we going to the barbecue place? They probably thought like, what's with this kid? Like he just wants to go to the funeral home so that we can get a sandwich. That's all I thought. But when you're around grief, our culture has sometimes a tendency to avoid the intensity of what we feel in it, right? We have a tendency to go, this happened, now let's jump to a resolution. Let's jump to a reason this happened. Let's figure out ways, but we skip the sitting and the emotion part, which is very vital. Now, let's do this way. We're going to talk about one of the prophets of the Old Testament. His name is Jeremiah. It's very fitting because Jeremiah is nicknamed the weeping prophet. And it's for a reason. Jeremiah was born in a very difficult time in the history of God's people. He was called as a prophet before he was even born. So God had laid out like, hey, this is what I'm going to have this guy do from the get-go. But his entire ministry was going to be telling his own people that if you don't turn from your ways, God has to draw a line in the sand with what you're doing. Because they were doing horrific things in the name of God. But Jeremiah does this ministry for 40 plus years. Some say 42, some say longer. And have almost no visible results to show for his ministry according to our standards. All that happened all throughout Jeremiah's life was him speaking out God's words and people wanting to either kill him, refusing to listen to anything he has to say, and continuing going down the same path over and over again. Can you imagine this? 40 plus years. Right? By that point, according to our modern standards, we would just already tell Jeremiah, you're not good at this. You're obviously not anointed by God because obviously you don't have anything happening. There's nobody getting saved. There's nothing happening. Maybe you should step down. The good part is the Bible doesn't teach us that is a telltale sign of what it means to do this, what it means to walk with God. His job was faithfulness and obedience, and the people had to respond accordingly. But unfortunately for Jeremiah, they didn't. So this is Jeremiah's life. We're going to zero in on Jeremiah chapter 20 because it gives us a picture of when Jeremiah is talking to God in the midst of this life. Now, this is about 20 years into this 40-plus year ministry is where this section happens. All right, so he's been doing this a long time. But I want you to just hear the raw words of Jeremiah, okay? Because here's the other thing. We like to approach the Bible sometimes and remove the intensity of it. Like, ooh, we shouldn't say that to God. Like, that's inappropriate. Well, let's see what Jeremiah, how he approaches it. All right, so Jeremiah chapter 20, we're looking at verses 7 to 13. And Jeremiah says, "O Lord, you have deceived me." Anybody like to start your prayers that way? You, God, have deceived me. Remember, a prophet, a guy who does this for a living. He says, you have deceived me and I was deceived. You are stronger than I and you have prevailed. I have become a laughingstock all the day. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I cry out, I shout violence and destruction. For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and derision all day long. If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, there is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I'm weary with holding it in, and I cannot. For I hear many whispering, terror is on every side. Denounce him, let us denounce him, and say all my close friends, watching for my fall. Perhaps he will be deceived, then we can overcome him and take our revenge on him. Right? This is Jeremiah's experience. He's saying, I'm speaking your words out over and over again, saying, God is going to draw a line in the sand. There is going to come violence and destruction if you don't turn for what you're doing. And instead, everybody responds with, let's see if he trips up so maybe we can take some revenge on him. Let's see if we can find a way to get rid of this guy, which eventually they do bar Jeremiah from the temple. They don't allow him to show up anymore. So he starts writing his stuff down and sending him with another person. That's what he has to do for a long time. This is what his response is. But here's where it turns, verse 11. But the Lord is with me as a dread warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble. They will not overcome me. They will be greatly shamed, for they will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord of hosts, who tests the righteous, who sees the heart and the mind, let me see your vengeance upon them, for to you have I committed my cause. Sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, for he has delivered the life of the needy from the hand of evildoers. Then you notice Jeremiah starts with this is the raw emotion, right? God, you have deceived me. What is he saying? God, you called me to this life, and I don't see you doing anything. Anybody felt like that before? We don't like to say it out loud, but I can guess some of us at least have felt that way. Guess what? God knows you feel that way. And it's not off limits in your time with God to say it to him. You're not gonna surprise him. Because here's the thing, it's not that God needs to hear it from us, it's that we need to put some words to our pain. Right? We cannot see healing in areas of grief without putting words to our pain. That's not just for me, that's a biblical definition, that's also a psychological definition. If you don't actually talk about your pain in a healthy way, it will not go away. And it will scar over in a way that will not ever actually heal. So Jeremiah voices all out to him. He puts it out there. Then you see him change up a little bit. It's not that he's saying that's not how I feel. He's saying I do know that the rest of this is true, right? He knows that God is who he says he is. And at the end of the day, God will do what he says he's going to do. But in Jeremiah's lifetime, he really doesn't get to see any of that. By the time his time is done, the violence and destruction God has decreed for the people because they never turned happens. And guess what? Jeremiah suffers along with the people. It's not like he gets to go and have a nice vacation because he finished his job and all the people go into exile. It's easy. Jeremiah gets taken with them. And then the people he's left with actually still don't believe him and end up putting him in chains and taking him to Egypt after his time is done. So just because he voices these things out and he trusts God, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden the situation necessarily changed. But it also doesn't mean that he didn't stop trusting even when his situation stayed the same. See, in our culture, I would say particularly American culture, right? Because it's different. If you go to other nations or even other cultures that are within the U.S., grief is something that's treated very differently. So many cultures in Africa, you know, when someone dies in their community, they'll spend 3 or more days just outwardly expressing their grief in their community for the loss that they've experienced. I mean, like, it'll make some of us uncomfortable how loud and expressive these things are. Same thing in Latino culture, same thing in a lot of Asian cultures. Nearly every other country in the world has a different approach to grief. But because in our American side, we tend to come from a more Greek stoic kind of background, we associate grief with something that we can show up to a funeral. And if you're the person that's at the loss, many times it's almost the expectation is you should have your brave face on. You should greet your guests. They should come up. They also greet you, and we go on. But no one feels free, a lot of times, to actually express the intensity of the grief that they're feeling. In the ancient Israelite culture, even to today, it's common for when loss happens for entire families to come be under the same roof for a minimum of 7 days and sit with you in your grief. They're not there to fix things. They're not there to try to give solutions. They're just there to be with you. Right? How much different could it be? And I'm not saying that we need to jump ship to just be a different expression, but I do believe that there is a suppression of how we deal with grief in our culture, which leads to so many issues of mental illness. It's something I learned being in the Detroit community, especially being around so many different diverse groups all the time, is the challenge of experiencing emotions to what they're supposed to be. If you are grieved, it is okay to experience grief. That means it's okay if crying comes up to cry. It doesn't matter who you're in front of. If you're grieving, it should be more normal to actually express that grief. Because I will tell you, you will not get to the other side of it otherwise. So even we have things, I'm gonna mention a few of these. I'm trying to behave myself on this end, because as someone who has been on the receiving end of grief several times, I'm mentioning a few things. These are some, I would say, unhelpful phrases, right? If you're around someone grieving, it's one thing when you're grieving, right? Maybe you've heard some of these. I'm gonna say they're not helpful, right? Because what happens when we get around someone who is in intense grief, we get uncomfortable, and so we have to just say something to try to help fix it. And sometimes we say some things that we probably should take back, okay? And the things I'm about to mention are all things I've heard personally said to me, okay? So I'm not throwing anybody else under the bus. This is just my lived experience here. Here's one that sometimes we like to do in Christian circles, like say you've lost someone in your life. It could be a spouse, could be a child, it doesn't matter. Someone who is close to you, you're there, you're experiencing the grief, and someone comes up into your line and say, hey, I'm so sorry, but everything happens for a reason. Now you might sit there and go, well, what's wrong with that? Well, here's the thing. They don't actually need us to fix it. They don't need us to give a rationalization for why it happened at all. Actually, the most helpful thing we can do when someone's in grief is say, I'm sorry. If they're up for it, hug them and just be there for them. That's it. We don't actually have to fix anything or try to. What happens is because we get uncomfortable. We feel like we're not doing enough. And let's be honest, if you really want to go to the rabbit trail of like, okay, well, what reason did this happen? Right? If you want to ask, everything happens for a reason, we could go down that trail. And it's like, well, when I've had some people, especially I've been serving in ministry, who have like lost a loved one to a drunk driver. Some very intense things, a very unexpected loss, tragedy, and someone comes up and says, hey, well, everything happens for a reason. What that does is says, well, God must have some kind of plan for your pain. And I agree to that, but what it does is go, well, every time something happens, God's behind pulling someone from your life just so you can learn something from it, which I take as theologically problematic according to the Bible. Yes, something happened for a reason. This person chose to do this and it resulted in a death. That's all the reason there is. That's one. That was probably easier. When we experienced loss, especially losing a child when we were overseas, one of the things that we heard not just once, but multiple times was, well, hey, you're young, you can have another one. Hopefully you've never heard that. But let me just put that forward, that's not helpful. Because yes, is that factual? Probably, depending on the person's circumstances. But does that do anything about the loss I'm feeling for the child I lost now? No. What it does is say, hey, skip over this pain. Let's just jump to a solution. Right? Do you see how even when we're trying to be helpful, what we're really saying is push those emotions down because it's making everybody uncomfortable. And let's get to, hey, let's fix this. Right? We've got to let go of, in our American culture, a fix-it mentality when it comes to grief. Because we have to be okay with sitting in the uncomfortability. This is something that the Bible preaches to us. It's not just once or twice. It's all throughout. It is let the emotions go, but direct it in a way to the person who can handle it first and foremost. And then have a community around you that can continue walking you through it. Because you notice with Jeremiah, and this is not just Jeremiah, this is the Psalms, this is Lamentations, this is all the examples of grief. Their first and foremost person they go to with their grief is with God. Because they know he can handle it. They know they can say everything that's on their heart in full detail. And I can guarantee you, if we at least started our prayer lives when we experience grief with giving God the raw, honest truth, then we would automatically get to a place where we could start to see some healing. So in Jeremiah's section here, there's 4 sections actually he lays out. And this is called a lament. Just like the book of Lamentations is really what that is. A lament is something from the ancient cultures that was a prayer way that they expressed their grief. So I want to give us as a tool, this is not, of course, the all-encompassing way we deal with grief, right? We're really just talking about how do we start the process. And that is, a lament is a great way to start that, right? We're still going to need community around us. We're still going to possibly even need a medical health professional to actually help us, mental health professional. But this is just one thing you can take with you from Jeremiah's prayer. The first one he does is, in a lament, is in 4 parts. The first part we call it the turn. And in the turn section, you're just turning to God with our pain and our grief, right? We've already detailed that. He is the person that knows you inside and out, loves you to no end, and can absolutely see to the depths of our hearts, and we can trust him with that grief. The second part, though, is where we get uncomfortable. It's called the complain section. And it is to honestly and specifically lay out the pain, the struggle, or the injustice that we've suffered. It's to humbly but bluntly identify what's wrong. As I said before, we have to put words to our pain. And this is where we can start that by verbalizing it to God. Right? Lay it out there. You don't have to hold back. He actually, even in this section of Jeremiah, right after this, he actually goes through a whole section of talking about how he wished he was never born to see this much pain. And you know what? There are times where people say things in the Bible and God comes back and says, hey, that was over the line. That's not mentioned anywhere in this section of Jeremiah. He never once rebukes him for saying any of these things, which is a sign God is okay with us voicing out the truth that comes up. So after we've humbly but bluntly identified what's wrong, the third section is we should ask God for help, right? Make a bold request of God to act, but it's anchored in his promises and his character. Here's the thing, if we have an issue with God's character, this is going to be problematic. Any kind of hardship we have with our relationship with God may come up here. Because if we don't actually trust him, then we're not going to trust him actually to be faithful, even in hard things. But this is where that relationship we have, especially those who have said, I follow Jesus, I'm part of this family. This is that invitation to go, I can come to him and trust that even in my bad circumstances, that he is faithful, that he is good. And that even if I don't see a change, I know that he is working on my behalf. Finally, the fourth section is that trust. It's choose to trust God in God's goodness, love, and sovereignty, even when circumstances have not yet changed. See, at the end of the day, this isn't a fix-it mentality, right? It's not, I express these out to God so then he takes away my pain or that he changes my circumstances. It's for us to be able to find healing in the midst of brokenness that we experience. It's so that we can move forward in our lives and still be able to love and give love to those around us. Theologian Christopher Wright is one of my favorite people. He has this quote of this section of Jeremiah. It's a little long, so kind of track with me. But he says this. He says, Jeremiah knew that the highest form of praise was not just to say nice things to God or about God. Rather, real praise meant to acknowledge the reality and presence of God in all situations and circumstances, no matter how fraught with contradictions. To go to God with your pain and protest, your anger and anxiety, and to give full vent to them before God's face is also a form of praise. It might get you a gentle rebuke, but it could also get you renewed promise and fresh faith for the hard road. Right? If we want the fullness that this life has to offer in our relationship with God, we have to kind of unbuckle a little bit of the restraints that say, oh, I need to look a certain way to God. I need to pray a certain prayer to him so that way he accepts me because I'm put together. Look, God, at how strong I am in dealing with this. God's the one person you don't have to do that with. He's the one person that already knows what's in there, and he invites you to put words to it, to come to him as a son or daughter could come to a good father in their life where they don't have to perform, they don't have to put on a face, they can actually say what's on their heart. This is the one great thing about kids. They have no filter when it comes to that. They will come to you and they will absolutely tell you what they think, good, bad, or ugly. They'll roast you to your face. and have no qualms about it, right? We need an unfiltered relationship with God. Because when grief happens, when the hard things happen, that's the only place that we're gonna have wholeness and healing, right? And like we're saying throughout this series, this is kind of a step one, right? If we have faith in God, we're approaching him in prayer, this is step one, but it's not the whole picture. Sometimes grief requires much more than just praying through your stuff, right? This is where we want to get to, of just saying, not only do we need this, we need so much more. But here's the final question I kind of leave you with, at least in the biblical side, and that's, are we willing to trust God with our grief? Are we really willing to lay it out there with him and allow the cultural restraints to be left in the culture? For us to learn, what does it mean to walk as a biblical family with God and say, God, I went through this. This was not okay. This is where I'm having a hard time with you. It's where I'm having a hard time with the people in my life. All of it, put it out there. We need to get to a place where we can trust that even though we've experienced grief, that God's goodness is still there and it's still tangible. It's there for us to tap into. Now, with our invitation, this is just a question to ponder, but as we're getting into just a time to respond, one thing to note, maybe you're someone who needs a more intentional community to walk through. Maybe you've gone through something in your life and you're like, hey, every time that gets brought up, I feel this, this reaction that comes up, right? You know what I'm talking about. If someone brings up a certain situation, before you can even think, you feel it. It comes up, whether it's anger, whether it's distrust, whether it's something. That's a telltale sign. Maybe you need a more intentional community to walk through, right? So here at Beach Church, there's 2 times a year, there's a group, it's called Grief Share, right? One starts in January, the next one starts up in August. But maybe you've gone through a loss and you need to walk through that with a group of people that can help you do that. That's one way we can invite community around us. But for some of us who maybe you've gone through some very extreme things, right? Things in your past, you need to reach out to somebody, and maybe that is a mental health professional. Because sometimes the things are so rooted in, so deep, we can't climb out of them by ourselves. We need someone who has the skills and the ability to help us untangle those things in a way that is healthy and loving for you. And so if that's you, there's this QR code, I know it comes up here, where it's a resource page for you to be able to access, for you to find people that's been vetted by this church, people that have a partnership that you can reach out to and say, hey, how can I start this journey? Right? But even in this last little bit, all of us, as we kind of stand, we're going to do our pray, give, sing, right? So maybe at least for now, you need to come up and spend some time in prayer here at the altar. You can take up any of these spots along the front. There's also prayer stations in the back where you can go back and have someone pray with you and maybe start to put some language to what this looks like. For others, maybe this is a time for you to respond in worship, right? Just to sing the faithfulness of God. But also, this is also a time to give, right? Out of the abundance of what God has done in our lives, we give not because God needs something from us, but because it's a sign of trust and love back to him. No matter what that is, whatever the Holy Spirit's inviting you to, that's what I want you to have the boldness, have the courage, right? Step into. Spend some time exploring your heart and asking God, what do you want me to do? So let me pray for you guys, and we'll spend some time in response. Father, we thank you that you're a good Father. Thank you that you invite us in our brokenness, in all of the emotions, God, that we experience. That you're not afraid of those things. That you don't expect us to come fully polished and good looking to you. That you invite us even in our ugliness, even in our raw states, even whatever is on our heart, that you invite those things out. Because God, you invite us to a life of freedom. You invite us to a life of your goodness. So I pray against the restraints that we put on ourselves. I pray, God, that you help us to ungrip the things that hold us back so that we can not only find healing in our grief, but that we can also find a fullness, God, of your joy and your love that we can't experience otherwise. So this time of response, I just pray, God, Holy Spirit, for you to move, for you to put boldness in the hearts of the people that need to make a step today. So just pray you help us, God, to step forward, to take charge in this effort to find healing, as you are the great healer, God. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.